A police officer heard the weakest cry in a blizzard barely more than a whimper. He followed it through the snow and found 3 newborn puppies, freezing, alone, not even old enough to open their eyes. But that was only the beginning, because what he discovered next buried beneath rot, rope, and silence unraveled a secret darker than he imagined, and led him straight to their mother. What happened will warm your heart and remind you that hope can survive even the coldest places. Before we dive in, do you believe animals remember those who hurt them, and those who saved them? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe every innocent creature deserves a second chance, hit that subscribe button, because this story might just restore your faith in kindness and in something greater watching over us all. Snow Ridge, Montana. A town cradled by evergreens and hemmed in by the jagged breath of the Bitterroot Mountains was no stranger to snow, but tonight was different. The sky had fallen into a fit of fury, sending sleet like shattered glass against windows and coating the world in a howling white blindness. The wind shrieked down the empty main road, rattling shutters and moaning through the gaps of old log cabins. Deputy Mason Carter stood at the window of his small office, arms folded tightly across his chest. He was 35, tall, with a rangy build that came from years on the job, more mountain-worn than gym-toned. His square jaw was lined with faint stubble, peppered at the chin with early gray, and his steel-blue eyes carried the weariness of a man who had seen too much and rested too little. A scar curled faintly under his right eyebrow, a memory of a bar fight gone wrong back in his rookie years. He wore the standard Navy Sheriff's Department jacket over a worn flannel, his badge dull under the office light. Tonight, like most nights in the off-season, had been quiet. Too quiet. Until Liam arrived. The knock was barely audible over the wind, but Mason heard it. When he opened the door, a small figure stood bundled in a puffy red coat, a wool hat slipping over wide hazel eyes. 8-year-old Liam Hartley was the kind of boy who rarely spoke, partly due to selective mutism, partly from a sadness that clung to him since the accident. His mother, a nurse, had died in a winter car crash 2 years ago, just down I-90. Since then, he'd lived with his grandfather in a weather-beaten cabin a quarter-mile from the station. Liam didn't say a word. Instead, he extended a wrinkled piece of notebook paper, smudged at the corners. Mason crouched, accepting it gently. It was a child's drawing. A box, snow, 3 small round shapes and jagged lines above. A storm. "Where?" Mason asked. Liam pointed behind the station toward the alley that led to the woods. Mason didn't hesitate. He grabbed his flashlight and coat, pulling the door shut behind him. Snow lashed at his face the second he stepped outside. The flashlight beam danced across the blanketed ground, catching drifts and the twisted shadow of the old chain-link fence. The boy trailed him silently. As he rounded the corner, Mason saw it. A cardboard box, barely visible beneath a layer of fresh snow, was pressed up against the back wall of the building. It trembled ever so slightly. He dropped to his knees, pushing back the wet cardboard flaps. A sharp breath escaped him. 3 tiny puppies, no bigger than a man's palm, were curled into each other, their fur soaked, bodies shivering uncontrollably. Their eyes were sealed shut, their limbs weak. One gave a feeble squeak, the sound heartbreakingly soft against the roar of the wind. "Jesus," Mason whispered, already shrugging out of his coat. He wrapped the puppies gently, careful not to crush them, and rose with urgency. "Liam, we have to get them inside." The boy nodded and followed, his boots crunching through the snow. Back inside, Mason moved swiftly. He set the puppies on a towel beside the heater and grabbed the radio. The station's vet partner, Dr. Grace Holloway, was still on call. He pressed the button. "Grace, it's Mason. Emergency. 3 newborn pups, hypothermic. I need you at the clinic now." There was static, then her voice came through, clipped and calm as ever. 10 minutes. Keep them warm. No milk, just warmth. Grace Holloway was a woman of precision mid-40s, tall and narrow-shouldered with silver-streaked hair she never bothered to dye. Her voice often came across as blunt, but those who knew her understood it masked an enormous heart. A divorce 5 years ago and the quiet loss of her only child to leukemia had left her soul reshaped. Compassion honed through pain. Mason layered dry towels around the puppies. One let out a chirp still alive. They needed warmth, but more than that, they needed time. "Hang in there," he murmured, eyes flicking to Liam, who sat cross-legged on the bench, staring at the pups as if willing them to breathe. 10 minutes later, headlights cut through the snow as Grace's old Jeep pulled up. She came through the door with a wind-blasted face and a metal crate in one hand. "Box," she said, nodding at the corner. "Let me see them." Mason helped her transfer the pups. Grace pulled out a mini heat lamp and plugged it into the generator outlet Mason had installed the previous year. "Too young, eyes still sealed, maybe 3 days old at most," she muttered, examining them. "Damn lucky you found them when you did." "I didn't," Mason said quietly, turning to look at Liam. "He did." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Smart kid." Liam said nothing, but a tiny smile formed at the corner of his mouth. It was the first time Mason had seen him smile in months. The puppies began to stir under the gentle heat, one letting out a longer squeak that sounded almost like a whimper. Grace checked them again, gently stroking their bellies. "They've got fight in them," she said. "We'll need to rotate warming and glucose every 2 hours. No idea who left them there?" Mason shook his head. "No cameras on that side. Could be anyone passing through." "Could be someone local," Grace added, lifting one of the pups, a cream-colored one with a tiny blaze of brown between its ears. "Some breeder dumping the litter. No tags, no microchips. I'll start digging tomorrow." Grace nodded. "Tonight, we just keep them alive." Mason watched the pups breathing, the rise and fall tiny but determined. Snow still raged outside, but in this room, a flicker of something warm had sparked. He glanced down at Liam again. "You did good tonight, kid." Liam said nothing. But he scooted closer to the crate, eyes fixed on the puppies like they were the most precious thing in the world. And maybe, Mason thought, they were. The blizzard hadn't let up. Outside, the white wall of snow still howled, cloaking the town of Snow Ridge in a cold silence that muffled even the wind chimes at the diner across the street. Inside the police station, however, warmth pulsed from the heater, casting a golden glow over the bundled towels where 3 tiny lives stirred. The pups had survived the night. Rusty was the first to move, his little legs kicking out in clumsy spasms, pink belly rising with unsteady breaths. His coat, a reddish-brown mottled with black at the ears, shimmered faintly under the lamp. Next to him, Luna squirmed softly, the smallest of the trio, her fur nearly silver in the light. And finally, Toby, the largest, black with a white stripe down his spine, let out a squeaky yawn that made Liam laugh aloud. Not loudly, but clearly, and Mason heard it. It was the second sound Liam had made in a year. Grace had returned that morning, still in her thick beige parka with a patch of coyote fur on the hood. Her boots clumped snow onto the hardwood, but she didn't care. She moved quickly, professionally, carrying a satchel of formula, syringes, and gauze. Her eyes had softened as soon as she saw the pups still breathing. "They made it," she said. Then, lowering her voice, "Barely." Mason leaned forward, concern creasing his forehead. "Will they be okay?" "Still fragile," Grace replied, kneeling to examine each pup. "But they've got a chance." She lifted Luna gently and paused. Something tugged at the tiny pup's neck. Her fingers probed under the fur and her brows lifted. "Mason, get over here." He crouched beside her, and together they gently brushed the fur away. Around Luna's neck was a tiny collar leather, damp but intact. Etched crudely into the surface was a single letter, L. Grace checked the others. Each pup had one. R for the reddish male, and T for the striped one. Mason narrowed his eyes. Not just abandoned pups. Someone owned them, cared enough to collar them, then dumped them. Or worse, Grace added. These collars look handmade. Someone carved these in themselves. The implication sat heavy between them. Mason rubbed his hands together, thinking. Rusty, Luna, Toby. he said, assigning the letters to names. "They deserve real names now." Grace nodded slowly, though her eyes lingered on the leather bands like they held some secret she couldn't quite decode. Liam, who had been quietly drawing at the corner desk, looked up. He pointed to the pups and smiled when Mason repeated the names aloud. "Rusty," Mason said, pointing to the red one. "Luna." He motioned to the silver pup, and finally, "Toby." The black one gave a faint bark in return. A smile crept up Liam's face, shy, fragile, but genuine. He held up his notebook again. This time the drawing showed the 3 pups snuggled together under a sun. Their eyes were open in the picture, even though in reality they were still sealed shut. "He's hopeful," Grace said gently, standing to remove her gloves. "More than most adults I know." Just then the front door opened with a jingle of the old brass bell. A woman stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat. "Hello?" she called, her voice light but firm. "Sorry to barge in. The sign says open." Mason turned. The woman was in her early 30s, with sun-touched skin and wavy auburn hair tucked beneath a gray beanie. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and her large green eyes scanned the room with quick intelligence. "I'm Rayanne Miller," she said, offering a polite wave. "I run the general store down the road. Brought a box of canned goods and extra blankets, heard someone found a litter." Rayanne had grown up in Snow Ridge but spent 10 years in Seattle before returning after a bad breakup and her father's illness. She was known around town for her big laugh, her fiery opinions, and her habit of naming every animal she met, even raccoons. Mason thanked her, gesturing to the pups. "Meet Rusty, Luna, and Toby." Rayanne's eyes softened instantly. "They're beautiful." She crouched beside the crate, her presence calm. Even Rusty lifted his nose slightly at her scent. "Who would do this?" she murmured. Mason was wondering the same thing. The callers suggested care, maybe even affection, but why leave them to die? After Rayanne left, promising to bring more supplies the next day, Mason returned to his desk. He opened his laptop, launching the state's pet registration database. No matches came up for the initials R, L, or T on file. No litters, reportedly lost, no recent breeder entries. He frowned. "They're ghosts." Grace, packing up her gear, glanced at Liam. Not to him. Liam was now curled up on the floor, head resting near the crate. He hadn't spoken, but his drawings had changed. Where once they were gray and sharp and filled with snow, now they had color. A rising sun, a green tree, 3 puppies chasing butterflies. That night, Mason took the pups home. He had a heat lamp set up in the corner of his living room. As they slept, nestled in towels, he sat back in his recliner, letting the hum of the fireplace lull his thoughts. Somewhere beneath his ribs, a strange ache had started to form, a quiet but persistent feeling he hadn't known in years. Hope. The storm had broken 2 days ago, leaving Snow Ridge wrapped in a deceptive calm. The world glistened beneath a bright winter sun, as if trying to pretend it hadn't just been ravaged by ice and fury. Tree limbs bent beneath the weight of snow, icicles like daggers hung from rooftops, and animal tracks crisscrossed the forest edge like forgotten thoughts. Deputy Mason Carter zipped up his jacket and adjusted the strap on his rifle. Not for protection, he never expected trouble in these woods, but for habit. The trail he walked now twisted deep into Pine Hollow, a dense patch of forest on the town's western edge where fallen logs and brambles made navigation slow. He hadn't planned on patrolling today, but something tugged at him, a sense left over from years of instinct on the job, the same instinct that had screamed at him to check behind the station during the blizzard. As he walked, his boots crunched lightly over the snowpack. The cold gnawed at his cheeks, but his breath came steady. Thoughts of the pups, Rusty, Luna, and Toby, filled his mind. They were doing better. Last night, all 3 had suckled weakly from the bottle. Even Luna, the smallest, had wriggled with something that resembled determination. Their resilience amazed him. A sudden sound snapped him out of thought. It was faint, just a single, strained bark, a strangled cry. Mason stopped, tilted his head. The sound came again, further in, desperate, as if the creature behind it had no breath left to give. He moved toward it without hesitation. 15 minutes of pushing through underbrush brought him to a small clearing. The snow here was disturbed, flattened, and as he neared the trees, he saw it. A dog. Tied tightly to the base of a pine tree with coarse rope, her body slumped, her ribs sharp beneath her dull fur. Her snout had been forcibly muzzled with an old leather strap, her eyes wide, glassy, and hollow. Snow had built up around her paws, nearly encasing her. If not for the shallow rise and fall of her chest, she would have looked dead. Mason swore under his breath and rushed forward. "Easy, girl," he murmured, kneeling. "I got you." She didn't fight. She didn't have the strength. Up close, he saw she was a German shepherd, likely 4 or 5 years old, with patches of black and tan in a familiar pattern. Her eyes were amber and weary, her left ear torn at the tip. She reeked of infection and frost. Mason pulled out his knife and carefully cut the rope. Then, with steady hands, he undid the strap around her muzzle. Blood had crusted around her mouth where the leather had cut in. The moment it came free, she collapsed forward, whimpering softly. "Hang in there," he whispered, already pulling off his jacket. He wrapped her in it, careful to avoid the raw spots on her flanks. "You're not alone anymore." He radioed for help as he carried her through the trees. Grace arrived 20 minutes later in her Jeep, face grim as she stepped into the clearing Mason had marked. She wore a forest green coat with padded sleeves and boots caked in mud and slush. Her breath formed short clouds as she knelt to examine the dog already bundled in a blanket Mason had retrieved from her emergency kit. "She's starving," Grace said immediately, "and her hind legs sprained, maybe fractured. She's dehydrated, malnourished, and her paws are frostbitten. Whoever did this didn't want her to survive." Mason clenched his jaw. "She matches the pups. The coat pattern. The size, she's their mother." Grace gently moved the dog's head, checking her ears. "Let's confirm." She pulled out a scanner and waved it near the dog's neck. A beep sounded. Then, silence. No ID number. The signal was scrambled. "Looks like someone tampered with her chip," Grace muttered. "Either replaced it or jammed the signal. It's deliberate. Whoever did this knows how to cover tracks." Mason looked down at the dog, who had begun to stir, eyes flickering open. They held no fear, only pain, and something else, longing. He spoke softly. "You're safe now. We're going to take you home." When they returned to the station, the pups were still in the heated crate near the fireplace. Mason and Grace laid the mother nearby on a soft pad, heating discs tucked beneath her body. As soon as the first of the puppies whimpered, Rusty, the boldest, letting out a tiny yip, the dog lifted her head. Her ears perked, trembling. Her body tensed. Her eyes locked onto the crate. Grace leaned down. Oh, God, that reaction. She knows them. Mason opened the crate slowly, and one by one, he let the pups crawl toward her. What followed was the kind of quiet miracle Mason knew better than to speak over. The dog, weak as she was, pulled herself forward, nosing each puppy with gentle whines. They climbed over her, rooting at her fur, recognizing her scent, her warmth. Rusty settled near her chest. Luna curled under her paw. Toby pawed at her muzzle as if to say, "Where have you been?" She licked each one in turn, her body shuddering with exhaustion and relief. Grace wiped her eyes and gave a crooked smile. "That confirms it." Mason placed a hand on the dog's back. "Let's call her Daisy." "Daisy?" Grace echoed. Something soft. Something she's never had. Daisy closed her eyes, her breathing slower now, steadier, surrounded by her pups. From the doorway, Liam watched in silence. He had drawn something again, paper clutched to his chest. This time, he didn't hand it to Mason. He walked over to Daisy, crouched beside her, and laid the drawing gently on her blanket. It showed a tree, a dog, 3 puppies, and beneath them a name written in shaky, blocky letters, Daisy. The air had sharpened overnight, stripping the warmth from the sky and painting the trees in a brittle sheen of frost. Snow Ridge sat beneath a silver canopy that morning, the sun a faint blur behind thinning clouds. Mason Carter sat at his desk, still in his thick thermal shirt, eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. The glow from the monitor illuminated the dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Daisy's body tied to that tree. And those pups, helpless in that box. Something wasn't right. Someone went to great lengths to make them disappear. He sipped lukewarm coffee, opened the state veterinary registry software, and found himself staring at a login screen that required more clearance than he had. After a pause, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a dry, familiar voice answered. "You finally get tired of doing things by the book?" Mason exhaled a laugh. "Morning to you too, Gene." Dr. Eugene Bayer had been Snow Ridge's only large animal vet until he retired 5 years ago. A wiry man in his 60s with wiry eyebrows to match, Gene had once saved an entire barn full of calves during a viral outbreak. Now he lived in Billings but still worked with the state vet board in systems management, mostly remote, mostly for beer money. "I need help," Mason said. "Got a shepherd. Female. Chip scrambled. I need to know where she came from." "You've got a scan image?" "Sending now." Gene muttered under his breath and began typing furiously. Mason could hear the tapping echo through the speaker. 10 minutes later, Gene's tone changed. "Got something. Chip's partially corrupted, but I pulled metadata. 5 years ago, a dog named Lady Bell was registered to Mallory Ridge Kennels. Owner, Greg Mallory." Mason sat back slowly. "Greg Mallory? Son of a... Thought you'd remember him. Kennel's license was revoked 2 months ago. Failed inspections. Dogs disappearing. Health complaints. Sound familiar?" Mason's jaw tightened. Too familiar. Mallory had been a problem for years. Big man with a greasy smile, thinning blonde hair always slicked back like it had something to hide. He ran that kennel like a back alley operation, but kept it just legal enough to dodge shutdown. Until now, apparently. Gene continued. "I also found a record of Mallory transferring a few animals before closing up. No adoption papers, no buyers listed. Just dispersed. That's a red flag." "Yeah," Mason muttered. "Big one." He thanked Gene and hung up. The connection between Daisy, once Lady Bell, and Mallory Ridge Kennels was now undeniable, but he still didn't have a location. Not until Liam stepped in. Across the room, the boy sat at his usual corner desk. Since Daisy returned, he had become more engaged, never speaking, but always observing, always drawing. His latest sketch was unusually detailed. Mason crossed the room and glanced down. It was a cabin. Not just any cabin. The windows were striped with a crisscross design. There was a crooked chimney, a leafless tree beside it, and a coil of something rope, maybe wrapped around the tree base. Mason crouched. "You've seen this place?" Liam hesitated. Then he nodded. Mason frowned. "Where?" The boy reached for a different sketchbook, flipping back to an earlier page. He pointed to a trail, a narrow path with pines on both sides and a tiny pair of stick figures. A man and a child. One held a cane. Mason's heart skipped. "Your grandpa?" Liam nodded again. Mason remembered now. Harold Whitaker, Liam's grandfather, used to take long walks in the woods before his arthritis worsened. They often stayed off the marked trails. Mason himself had once run into them near Harlow Ridge, close to the old hunting paths that crisscrossed the mountain. He stood, walked over to the bulletin board by the station door, and pulled down a faded topo map. His finger hovered over a section north of town. "Harlow Ridge," he said to himself. Then a memory clicked. 2 years ago, a hunter had reported hearing weird animal sounds out near an old shack at the base of the ridge. It was dismissed as coyotes, but now... Mason turned back to Liam. "Did something happen there?" The boy's face tightened. He pulled out a new sheet, drew a crooked house, and added a sound bubble with jagged lines. Then he shaded in a dark shape in one window, eyes, watching. Mason felt a chill creep down his neck. "You heard something?" Liam didn't react, but he placed his hand over Daisy's paw, as if to say, "That's where she was." Mason jotted everything down, the ridge, the cabin, the memory, the fear in Liam's picture. Just as he stood to gather his gear, Grace entered the room. She was in jeans and a padded parka, boots wet from snow. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight braid today, and there was a smudge of iodine on her wrist. She took one look at Mason's expression and said, "Let me guess. You found something." He nodded. "Greg Mallory. He's connected to Daisy, and Liam's seen the place, a cabin in Harlow Ridge." Grace exhaled slowly. "Then it's time we start following the trail." Mason turned back to Liam. "You helped more than you know, buddy." The boy offered no words, but his eyes lingered on Daisy, and when the dog gave a soft whine in return, Mason could swear, for the briefest second, he saw understanding pass between them. The snow had returned by dawn, not heavy, but drifting in soft, ghost-like curtains that dusted the pines and softened the forest's harsh outlines. Mason Carter tightened the strap on his snowpack as he stepped out of his cruiser at the trailhead to Harlow Ridge. Grace Holloway followed a few steps behind, her long stride cutting clean paths through the powder. She wore a thermal-lined coat, the color of storm clouds, and though her face was partially hidden under a wool hat, her eyes held a quiet focus that Mason had come to trust. Daisy, now strong enough to walk short distances, was fitted with a padded harness. She moved cautiously beside Mason, occasionally sniffing at the snow, ears twitching with each whisper of the wind. The three of them made their way into the woods, the trail gradually narrowing as they climbed into older, wilder territory. "Last time I was up here," Mason said, breath clouding before him, "I was 17 and tracking mule deer with my dad. Never thought I'd be back with a dog leading me." "Or looking for someone's dirty secrets," Grace added, her voice even. After nearly an hour of trekking, they reached a clearing where a squat, weathered cabin slouched against a backdrop of bare trees. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, and one shutter had fallen from a crooked window. The striped pattern on the remaining panes matched Liam's drawing exactly. Snow curled along the base like it was trying to bury the place from memory. Daisy stopped at the edge of the clearing. Her body stiffened, and she let out a low, uncertain growl. "She remembers," Mason murmured. They approached with caution. The front door hung slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges when Mason pushed it open with his gloved hand. The interior was as cold as the outside. Dust floated like ghosts in the air, stirred by their presence. Broken furniture lay in heaps, and a small iron stove rusted shut in the corner. The scent of rot and old urine lingered beneath the must of wet wood. Grace scanned the room with clinical precision. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was used recently. Near the back wall they found a pile of discarded rope. Beside it, an old muzzle, stained and stiff with age, still held traces of fur in its metal clasp. Mason crouched, lifting it gently. "Too small for a full-grown shepherd," he said, "but perfect for a dog just reaching breeding age." Grace's eyes narrowed. Which would have been Daisy, a year or two ago. In a splintered cupboard, they discovered a cracked plastic bowl. Inside were dried flakes of kibble, green with mold. Next to it, Mason spotted a leather-bound notebook. He pulled it free, brushing dust from the cover. The initials G.M. were burned into the corner. "Greg Mallory," he muttered. Flipping it open, they found pages filled with neatly scrawled dates, names of dogs, and cryptic symbols, arrows, X's, and circles. At the top of one page was Daisy's old name, Lady Bell, followed by notes about heat cycles, pairings, and litter counts. Grace paled. This was a breeding log. "A cruel one," Mason replied. "None of these names show up in any adoption registries." As they continued searching, Daisy pulled at her leash. She sniffed toward the far wall, pawing at a spot where the floorboards had darkened from years of damp. "Hold on," Mason said, kneeling beside her. He pried at the edge of a warped board. It gave way with a crack, revealing a small compartment beneath. Inside was a bundle of fabric once red, now brown with age and something darker. He unfolded it, a torn flannel shirt, soaked in blood long since dried. The smell hit him first, rusty, metallic, and unmistakable. Grace stepped back. "Human?" "No." Mason sniffed again. "Dog. but badly injured. He inspected the cloth further. Caught in one seam was a tuft of fur, black and tan. "Daisy's," he whispered. Daisy whimpered lowly, pressing her nose against the cloth. Mason placed a hand on her head, grounding her. "Whatever happened here, she remembers," he said quietly. "She survived something worse than we imagined." Just outside, fresh snow had begun to fall again, blanketing their footprints, erasing the path they'd come from. But inside, the past refused to stay buried. Grace moved toward the door. "We need to catalog all of this. Rope, muzzle, breeding records, the shirt. It's enough to build a case, especially with what we already have on Mallory." As they stepped outside, Mason paused, crouched near a patch of bare earth where the wind had swept the snow away. A set of tire tracks curved away into the woods, subtle but fresh. He snapped a photo with his phone. "Same tread pattern from the station's traffic cam," he muttered. "Truck that stopped near the gas station 3 nights ago. Mallory's?" "Only one way to find out," Grace said, watching the sky darken. "We follow it." The snow had thickened by midday, swirling like powdered bone across the windshield of Mason's cruiser as he drove back to the station. The silence inside the vehicle was heavy, broken only by the static hum of the police scanner. Grace sat in the passenger seat, flipping through the breeding log they'd taken from the cabin, each page a quiet indictment. "This man didn't just breed dogs," she said at last. "He used them, like tools." Mason tightened his grip on the wheel, and then dumped them when they broke. Back at the station, Liam was asleep on the padded bench near Daisy's crate. The pups were curled beneath their mother's belly, all 4 breathing slowly, peacefully unaware of the storm still circling their world. Rayanne Miller, the owner of the general store, was seated nearby with a warm thermos and her sleeves rolled up. Since learning about Daisy's past, she had been dropping in more often, bringing supplies, cleaning bowls, sometimes just sitting in silence with the animals. "Poor things are safe for now," she said softly when Mason and Grace entered. "But it still doesn't feel finished." Mason nodded and headed straight for his desk, where a large map of the region had been unrolled and pinned down with coffee mugs. He had marked the known locations tied to Greg Mallory, his old kennel, the cabin, the gas station. Each pin was connected with red string. He pulled up the traffic camera logs again. There it was, a battered dark green pickup truck with a bent rear bumper, caught idling near the edge of the Snow Ridge gas station 3 nights ago, the same night Daisy was found. The plate number, 8CK1907, had traced back to a salvage vehicle in Cheyenne, Wyoming, marked stolen. "That's why we couldn't find him," Mason muttered. "He's using ghost plates." Grace looked over his shoulder. "Wyoming?" Mason nodded. "And that's not all." He clicked open a profile on his screen. A booking photo popped up. Greg Mallory, aged 54. A wide, heavy-set man with thinning blonde hair, pockmarked cheeks, and small, pale eyes that never seemed to blink. Mason enlarged the record. 2 arrests in the past 10 years, 1 for animal cruelty, 1 for illegal transport of unlicensed dogs. Both charges mysteriously dropped after plea deals, until last year. A sealed court case had finally resulted in a conviction 6 months served for maintaining an illegal kennel in Rawlins, Wyoming. He'd been released early, disappeared off-grid, and apparently made his way back into Montana under the radar. Mason leaned back. "He's a known offender, and we're not the first town he's hurt." Grace was quiet. Then she opened her phone and tapped through a series of photos. "I thought his name sounded familiar." She showed Mason a grainy picture of a thin dog with matted fur, large ears, and ribs like piano keys. "This is Charlie," she said. "He came into the Flathead Rescue Center 6 weeks ago. Same breed line as Daisy. Same injuries, same behavior, terrified of leather straps." Mason looked closely. The resemblance was chilling. "They microchipped him at intake," Grace continued. "And guess whose name was linked to the old chip? Greg Mallory." Mason felt a cold satisfaction begin to burn. "That's our pattern. Repeat abuse, dumping, relocation." He pulled out the photo they'd printed earlier, Greg's latest mugshot. He placed it on the desk, then knelt beside Daisy's crate. "Daisy," he said gently, "you know this man?" The shepherd raised her head slowly. At first, there was only confusion in her eyes, but as she looked closer, something inside her changed. Her ears pulled back. A growl rumbled in her throat, not loud but deep and guttural. Her lips trembled, teeth barely bared, not in aggression, but in memory. That was all the confirmation Mason needed. "She remembers," he whispered. Across the room, Liam stirred from his nap. He rubbed his eyes, slid down from the bench, and walked over. Without a word, he crouched beside Daisy and laid his small hand on her paw. She stopped growling instantly. Her body relaxed, but her eyes stayed locked on the photo. "She knows who hurt her," Grace said softly. Mason rose. "And we know where he's hiding." He picked up his phone and called in a favor to an old contact in the Wyoming State Patrol detective, Colin Drake. Drake was ex-military, a tall man with a flat voice and a sharper mind. He had worked animal trafficking cases for years and had once gone undercover in an illegal breeder ring that spanned 3 states. Within an hour, Colin called back. "Your guy's got a trailer parked outside Buffalo, Wyoming," Colin said. "Goes by Grady Mitchell now. Pays cash at local shops, never sticks to one gas station. But he slipped. Bought a dog crate at a feed store under his real name last week. Clerk flagged it. Guess she follows animal rights news. You can hold him? If you give me cause." "You've got it," Mason said. "I'm sending over all the files. We have photos, vet records, recovered logs. You'll have it within the hour." He hung up and turned to Grace. "He's not running anymore." She didn't smile, but her shoulders softened. "Now we just wait." Mason nodded, but his jaw stayed clenched. It wasn't over yet, but something had shifted. The hunter had become the hunted, and Snow Ridge was one step closer to justice. The snow had melted into slush by the time the black SUVs rolled into Buffalo, Wyoming, tires slicing through the muddy gravel like scalpels through old scars. Parked outside a tired-looking trailer near the edge of a forgotten lot stood 3 agents, 2 from the FBI and 1 from the Animal Cruelty Task Force. They moved with quiet precision, jackets zipped high, earpieces in place. In the distance, a chain-link fence rattled in the wind. Greg Mallory was inside. Agent Valerie Cho led the operation. At 38, she was known for her exacting standards and sharp instincts. Of Korean-American descent, she stood just under 5'7", with a lean, wiry build and dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail. Years of working undercover had given her the gift of saying little but seeing everything. She had dealt with human traffickers, cartel breeders, even cross-border puppy mills, but there was something personal about this case. Maybe it was the photo of Daisy, her body wasted, tied to a tree. Maybe it was the quiet defiance in Mason Carter's voice when he asked for help. Either way, she'd made this case a priority. Greg's trailer was falling apart. Peeling paint, a crooked awning, broken screen door hanging like a loose tooth. The agents moved in silently. Valerie gave the signal. The door crashed open with one sharp kick. Inside, Greg Mallory stumbled up from a stained mattress, blinking against the flashlight beams. His once slick blonde hair had turned brittle and thin, his eyes bloodshot, hands trembling not from fear, but from days without proper sleep or hiding too long in his own stench. "Greg Mallory," Valerie announced. "Federal warrant for violation of animal protection statutes, interstate trafficking, and obstruction of enforcement. You're under arrest." His protest died in his throat the moment he saw the badge. His shoulders slumped. Back in Snow Ridge, word spread fast. The town may have been small, but it had a long memory and an even longer heart. When Mason returned with the news, the cafe doors swung open. Rayanne Miller shouted to the whole room before the bell above the door even stopped ringing. "They got him!" The applause wasn't loud, but it was real. For a town that had seen too much grief-lost livestock, lost pets, too many goodbyes, the news landed like sunrise after months of twilight. A month later, the courtroom in Helena, Montana, was packed. Local press, federal observers, and community members filled every bench. Daisy sat calmly beside Grace, wearing a red bandana, the pups resting nearby in a travel crate lined with flannel. Greg Mallory looked smaller in the courtroom than he ever had in person. Orange jumpsuit, chained at the wrists. His lawyer made the usual appeals: mental stress, lack of financial stability, misunderstandings in records. But none of it stuck. Then came the moment no one expected. Judge Ellery Bain, a silver-haired woman with a composed face and the piercing eyes of someone who'd lost a son to a drunk driver, looked down from the bench. "You're lucky we're not charging you with attempted manslaughter," she said. "If that mother dog had died in the forest, her pups would have followed. And with them, whatever ounce of humanity you had left." Mason stood to deliver a brief statement. He kept it simple, fact-based, grounded in the evidence. Then Grace followed, highlighting the veterinary records, the genetic ties between Daisy and other abused dogs found in Mallory's network. And then Liam. He hadn't been asked to speak, but during a recess he tugged gently at Mason's sleeve and handed him a drawing. It was a series of 4 panels. The first showed 3 pups in a box, snow falling gently around them. The second, a dog tied to a tree, head bowed. The third, a man kneeling to help. And the last, Daisy curled with her pups in a bed, safe, warm, with hearts drawn above them. Mason showed the judge. No words were necessary. Several people in the courtroom wiped away tears. Even the clerk hesitated before writing the next line. In the end, Greg Mallory was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for animal cruelty, illegal breeding, tampering with microchips, and unlicensed animal transport across state lines, with no parole for the first 3 years. But the story didn't end in the courtroom. Rayanne, together with a local carpenter named Tom Wexley, a burly man with a snow-white beard and a quiet devotion to strays, started fundraising for something new. Flyers went up around town. Local radio stations mentioned it during morning updates. Even school kids pitched in, selling cookies and hand-painted ornaments. 3 months later, just as the snow began to melt for good, ground broke on a small plot behind the fire station. The sign above the fence read, "Daisy's Haven, Snow Ridge Rescue and Rehabilitation Shelter." It wasn't fancy. Just 4 kennels, a shared clinic, and a patch of grass that would bloom come spring. But it was enough. Enough to tell the next story. Spring had arrived quietly in Snow Ridge, like a whisper woven into the thaw. The sharp edges of winter softened, and the last of the ice melted from the pine branches. Sunlight began to stretch longer into the afternoons, and the crisp air no longer bit at the skin, it kissed it. On the edge of town, just past the fire station and down a gravel path still wet with morning dew, sat a modest cabin with a wide wooden porch and a fenced yard where 4 tails wagged under open skies. Inside, the fireplace was unlit for the first time in months. Mason Carter stood in the middle of the living room, a mug of coffee in hand, gazing at the chaos that had become comfort: shredded, squeaky toys, 3 mismatched dog beds, and an overturned bowl near the back door. He smiled. Chaos used to mean crime scenes, missed sleep, and paperwork. Now it meant joy. Daisy lay curled near the sunlit window, eyes half closed, her body finally filled out with health and peace. At her side were her 3 pups. Rusty, now the boldest, tugged at a rope toy. Luna sat daintily like a queen, licking her paw, and Toby, the largest, was fast asleep on his back, legs splayed wide. And on the floor, cross-legged with a sketch pad in his lap, sat Liam. The boy visited nearly every afternoon. Sometimes he came with Rayanne, who had become a trusted friend and honorary auntie to the pups. Other times, it was Grace who dropped him off on her way to the clinic. Liam's presence in the cabin had become as natural as the sound of paw pads on hardwood. He had changed. His eyes were brighter now, his expressions more animated. He still didn't speak much, but he listened. He laughed softly when Rusty tripped over his own ears. He hugged Daisy each time he arrived, pressing his cheek against her fur like she was the only thing anchoring him to this world. Today, as Mason lowered himself beside Liam with a soft groan of his knees, the boy looked up from his drawing. It showed a family, not just dogs, but people too. A tall man with messy hair and a beard, a woman with a braid holding a stethoscope, a boy, and 4 dogs. Liam pointed to the word he had scrawled above them. It was shaky, misspelled at first, then corrected in careful, blocky print. Family. Mason's throat caught. Liam looked up at him, opened his mouth, and for the first time since his mother's passing, he spoke, barely a whisper, but clear. Family. Mason didn't move at first. Then slowly, he set the mug down, wrapped an arm around the boy's shoulders, and pulled him gently in. "Yeah," he said, voice thick. "You got that right." That evening, Grace stopped by with takeout from the new food truck that had somehow survived the winter. She wore jeans and a gray hoodie, her long braid draped over her shoulder. Her face had lost some of its tiredness, replaced by something softer, more open. She smiled easily now, especially around Mason. They ate on the porch, legs dangling over the steps while the dogs tumbled in the yard. The pups chased each other while Daisy lay under the porch swing, tail thumping at the sound of their voices. Grace leaned against Mason's shoulder. "They look like they've always belonged here." He nodded. "They do." A breeze picked up, carrying the scent of pine and melting earth. For the first time in a long time, the air didn't smell like sorrow. It smelled like beginning. Later that night, long after Grace had gone home and Liam had been picked up, Mason sat at his desk. The house was quiet but full, like the silence after a song. He opened his laptop and pulled up the final report. The case file on Greg Mallory had been closed officially, but there was one section left to write, the summary. He stared at the blank field, then began to type. Subject apprehended, convicted, and sentenced in accordance with federal cruelty statutes. Evidence chain completed. No further actions required. He paused. His fingers hovered, then moved again. Daisy and her pups were placed in permanent custody at Deputy Carter's residence, where they now thrive. Their rescue catalyzed the formation of Daisy's Haven, a local shelter built by community donation. In closing, though justice was served, the greater legacy lies in the lives saved, the voices healed, and the quiet resilience of those who never gave up. Not even in the snow. Mason leaned back, eyes on the screen, then saved the file and closed the lid. Outside the window, the first daffodil had bloomed beneath the fence line. He looked over at Daisy. She lifted her head, ears perked, and let out a soft chuff. "We're home," he said. "Sometimes miracles don't arrive in thunder or light, they come quietly, wrapped in fur found in snow. This story isn't just about a rescue, it's about redemption, about how broken things can still heal, about how even the voiceless like a trembling dog or a silent child can teach us what love truly means. Daisy was discarded. Liam was silent. Mason had locked his heart away, and yet, through an unexpected crossing of paths, something divine unfolded. It wasn't coincidence, it was grace, the kind only God can orchestrate. In life, we all face cold seasons moments where we feel abandoned, misunderstood, or forgotten. But just as spring follows winter, healing follows hurt. Sometimes God sends help not through angels in white, but through a shepherd with soft eyes, a boy with a broken past, or a pup who refuses to give up. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder. No act of kindness is wasted. No creature is too small for God's plan, and no moment is beyond redemption. Share this story if you believe in second chances. Comment. Amen if you believe God still works through unexpected miracles. Subscribe for more stories that prove goodness is still alive in this world. And may God bless you and every silent soul still waiting for rescue.